Welcome to the American Prospects weekly live stream. Um, I'm Ryan Cooper. I'm the Prospects managing editor, and joining me right now.
Sorry,
Hey, that's all right.
I, I'm
I
very
was,
late.
yeah, no, you're only about 30 seconds, so that's good. Yeah,
That's terrible. That's a terrible thing.
you're fired.
This is live. Wait a second. This is live television here. You can't be late. Hello, Ryan. How you doing?
Oh, not
You
too
picked a
bad.
you picked a great week to come back to to work at the Prospect. It's a really fun time in Democratic politics.
Yeah, I'm certainly not missing being on vacation. I feel like we've had a lot of really productive discussions. We're going to get into it. It doesn't at all feel like the country is circling the drain in any way.
No, not in any way. And we'll look at this and other countries this hour in the weekly roundup. The first thing I want to talk about actually is the story. We gave a soaring, optimistic take on July 4th. You did about the Constitution and what's left of it after this Supreme Court session. So I wanted to start by talking about it, and I actually brought my pocket Constitution. It's right here. Uh, Thank you to the American Civil Liberties Union. I got my pocket Constitution, so I want to go in and see what parts of it I can just get rid of. So let's go down the list. Why don't you just talk about just sort of generally what you took away from this Supreme Court session?
Yeah, it's not just this session, but I think this has seen a sort of culmination and an acceleration of
Right.
basically the engrossment of all political power in the hands of the judiciary and the president, if and only if the president is a Republican president. um you start with
But but this says Article 1 has the Congress as the thing that's first set up. So let's get into it. It says all legislative powers shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. Is that true anymore?
no. There used to be, as people have discussed, something called the Chevron doctrine, which basically was tie goes to the agency standard of statutory interpretation. So when you have legislative language that's very unclear, or liable to multiple interpretations, um, the courts would defer to the expert agencies that were set up by Congress with the explicit intention of giving them, fairly sweeping authorities. Like you say with the Clean Air Act, well, we want the air to be clean. Clean Water Act, we want the water to be clean.
Right.
Congress is not capable and did not want to set out to say, okay, we're going to write down all of the 100,000 different potential contaminants for air and water,
Right.
and we're going to set out explicit standards and how we're going to regulate the sources of these emissions. They say, no, EPA, you go and do that. You get your scientists together, you study the molecules, the sources of pollution, you set up a regulatory process to keep the people from being poisoned. That's an exercise of congressional power, telling the president, the executive branch, here's your task, now go out and do it. And if
Right.
we want to, we can amend the legislation. They have done that in the past, the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, added new standards or shored up the language here and there. Anyway,
Yeah.
the decision this time, uh, Relentless v. Department of Commerce and Loper Brighted Enterprises v. Raimondo, um, they basically have said they've overturned the Chevron doctrine. They've said
Right.
that now the courts are going to do all of that. If there's any dispute as to the interpretation of the statute, then the courts are going to be able to decide. And I think, in practice, it's going to be which moneyed interests have been bribing the court, giving them fancy vacations and whatnot. These sorts of things are going to predominate. The, regulatory state will be able to regulate things that are not important, that nobody cares about, nobody's going to file a lawsuit about. But now, in fact, we're already seeing a blizzard of lawsuits challenging the Biden administration's, various attempts to tamp down on junk fees and other deal with climate change. Anybody with a wallet and a lawyer on their Rolodex can now gum up the wheels of the government even more.
Right.
And
Let me say a couple things about that. First of all, this is certainly something that the courts were doing even before this particular doctrine was
yeah,
eliminated. They invented a new doctrine called the major questions doctrine, which says that all that Chevron stuff is thrown out the window as long as it's really, really important. So, and we, the Supreme Court, decide what's really, really important. That's what the major questions doctrine says, that you have to be much more specific in important rulings. And, as far as whether Congress doesn't have the capacity or the willingness to make bright line rules, I think it's more willingness. I
yeah,
mean, Chevron comes in 1984. Reagan was president in 1984. The reason Chevron was a case that was brought by the Natural Resources Defense Council, because the interpretation that was being made by the Reagan administration's, I believe, his EPA, went against the statutory interpretation of a stronger set of regulations against the executive. So Chevron has facilitated deregulation as much as facilitated regulation. The
true.
question is, Congress has leaned on that, and their policy making, their legislative, the writing of legislation has now had Chevron in mind for 40 years. And so they make these things intentionally vague, where they don't have to make these quite as vague. I mean, I think it's going to have to occasion a real change in how Congress does its business if it wants its mandates to stick. They're going to have to get into the game. They're going to have to get their hands a little more dirty. Maybe that means less legislation, but more impactful legislation. So, I mean, I think there's an interesting philosophical thing around, not just this particular piece of the Constitution that was shredded, but all of them. Congress is uniquely suited to push back on all this. But I want to keep going. So we've dispensed with Article 1, Section 2. We crossed that out. I crossed that out in my pocket Constitution. What about Section 2 of Article 1? That's just explains how to engage in electing members of Congress. That surely that's still part of the Constitution. Yes.
Yeah. It says, quote, the House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the several states. But of course, in Alexander v. South Carolina State Conference of the NAACP, the court basically said that egregious political gerrymanders, even if they are intentionally disenfranchising Black people, are fine. And
Right.
if we'll talk about this later with the UK elections, actually, but I think, in a first
Yeah.
past the post system, if your gerrymander is good enough, and especially if you live in a state like South Carolina, where basically race is a almost perfectly accurate proxy for parties,
Right.
you can render elections totally irrelevant. We saw this in Wisconsin for many years. I think it was in 2018 where the Democrats won the popular vote in the state assembly by about 8 points, and yet the Republicans got like 63% of the seats. You know,
Yeah.
and it just it's like a Hungary. It's a complete fake democracy where elections are just like a sort of patina of
Yeah.
fraudulent legitimacy you paint on the state government.
And
And
what
now with the House, Republican states can feel free to, insofar as they have control of drawing the
indeed,
districts.
indeed, what's interesting about the Wisconsin situation is obviously they got a state Supreme Court through elections that was majority Democratic. They immediately changed the gerrymander for legislative races in the state, but they did not change the gerrymander for the House elections there. And maybe part of that's because of other Supreme Court rulings, but because they're federal elections, and then that would go up to the federal Supreme Court. The same dynamic that you're talking about that was in place in Wisconsin for the state legislature also is in place for Congress, but that's not changing. There's this battle sort of within the states on who can gerrymander the most, depending on who's in control of the office that governs that, and that's obviously renders Section 2 a little weaker. I don't know if we need to go through each and every section here, but maybe we can summarize a little bit. Obviously, the next section is about impeachment, and maybe we can talk about here the Trump immunity ruling, which came out on Monday, and how much of the Constitution has been put in the trash compactor because of the Trump immunity ruling. Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, Trump v. United States. This was Trump's, I think, probably not even his legal team expected that he would get this favorable of a ruling. But, so he's facing all of these felony charges from Jack Smith, the special counsel, on,
Right.
for attempting to overthrow the government and,
It
bully.
seemed it seemed like the purpose of the rule, them attempting to block this through saying that presidents have absolute immunity, was just to keep the trial at bay, right? I
Yeah.
mean, that was the real reason that they put this together, not necessarily to get the ruling that they ended up getting.
Yeah, they were trying to run out the clock, I think. Um, but the Supreme Court 6-3 decision, and they come down with this entirely new standard of presidential immunity, which says that the president is totally immune from official acts, whatever he does in his standard his presidential powers that I think I've seen people describe it as some things that are not shared with Congress. So communications with the members of the cabinet or control of the military, that sort of thing. Then there's other presidential duties that are not part of the first bucket, and he gets presumptive immunity for that, and then no
Yeah.
immunity for private actions. And I think the effect of this, and one part of the ruling, by the way, says that if you are sorry, that any prosecutors can't use evidence that is part of the official
The official acts.
acts,
Yeah. Yeah.
in legal proceedings. Just like if you have, evidence of him, saying I have an idea in my head to do some crimes, and that is part of what he's doing as president, then no, you can't bring that up at the trial. And
Right. And you bring up this really interesting part, Article 1, Section 3, which says don't worry, impeachment is only removal from office and prohibition from holding office again. But don't worry, because the party convicted shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment according to law, which seems to be completely at odds with the decision that the Supreme Court made.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I was just actually reading one of the Federalist papers by Alexander Hamilton. I think number 80, but this Hamilton, of course, was one of the more pro-executive power, one of the more centralized, go president people among the folks who drafted the Constitution of the founding fathers. And he says almost exactly the same thing, that presidents are liable to impeachment, and then also they are liable for, they face legal accountability. Um, and I think, any scholar of the founding, and how the Constitution was set up. I mean, that the whole point of the revolution was to get, to set up something that's not a monarchy, and something with a rule of law. This is like a thing where they, when immigrants are sworn in as citizens, they have a ceremony, and one of the questions is anyone in America above the law? And you're supposed to say no. But now, they have deleted, not only this section for the president in Article 1, but pretty much the whole of Article 2. Article 2,
Right.
which sets out the president's powers. And by the way, as you say, Article 1 is Congress. Congress is supposed to be the central institution of the American government. That's what they give them, by far the most explicit powers of
Right.
coining money, post roads, post office, regulating
Right.
trade and commerce and all this sorts of stuff. The president is supposed to like carry out the will of Congress, run the
Take
military,
care. Yeah.
foreign policy. As my buddy Alexi said on our podcast, that for most of the 19th century, the president was much more of a figurehead than he is today. Like the whole
Mm-hmm.
executive branch as it existed, basically, that was a creation of like Franklin Roosevelt.
Yeah.
This was a just how the system has evolved, and now it's bloated beyond all recognition into, basically a king. I think on a just a square reading of this decision, the president could have the military murder his political opponents, members of Congress, members of the Supreme Court, whoever he wants, and it would not be okay to prosecute him for that. That's his
I mean,
official ethics.
I've seen the polls, Ryan. You might want to tamp down that rhetoric, lest you be the first test of these new powers. So yeah, I mean, I think that uh, we've seen this drift through the centuries here. It's kind of a one-way ratchet. Uh, Presidents want to use more and aggrandize more executive power. Congress, when it's in the hands of the same party as the president, wants to give that president more executive power, mostly because it's easier than going through the process of having to assemble a coalition to pass particular pieces of legislation. And so and also it's easier for presidents to take the heat for those decisions than members of Congress. That's what they like. They like being, immune from being charged with blame. So those various dynamics have moved things up into the executive, and then the Supreme Court has said anything that's not pinned down by the executive we'll take for ourselves, including executive power, because now we're going to be the last word on whether or not the executive branch can make regulations and carry out an original function, which was to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. So there's these various dynamics that are really distorting the manner in which the government operates. And you talk about more of those in here, whether it's the time, place, and manner clause, which is about regulating elections, which now the Supreme Court really has the power to do rather than Congress, to whom it was conferred. There's I think actually the one that's interesting to me is Article 1, Section 7. Let me go to it here in my pocket constitution. Article 1, Section 7, which says all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives. The Senate may propose or concur with amendments as on other bills. Now we saw the hint of this, and I think we're going to see, if there is a second Trump presidency, a lot more of this in the future. There was a Supreme Court ruling about the building of the wall, where the Roberts Court said that the president could take $6 billion from military that was apportioned specifically for the military and move that into building of the wall. Now the Trump administration or Trump campaign and various members, the Project 2025 movement have talked about this concept of impoundment. Impoundment is when the president engages in essentially nullifying various pieces of spending that the Congress has directed. This was ruled illegal and unconstitutional, and also Congress passed a law to change the impoundment theory and statute. But it looks like the Trump administration wants to bring that back. And in the hands of this court, they might have the chance to do so.
Yeah, just I mean, granting, the entire budgetary authority. I mean, the implications of that, if carried to an extreme, are almost hard to even imagine. Like yet more power. Like not only can you commit crimes with impunity, that now it doesn't matter what you
Yeah.
can spend whatever you want. It's like your own little piggy bank now for President Trump, and you can, set up your uh paramilitary organization to deport 20 million people, hire 50,000 more border guards, or yeah, like
Right.
what what Congress has
Move
been.
money around. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I want to go, we're moving on. We're going to Article 4, which there was one that wasn't in your thing that I want to talk about, which is Article 4, Section 2, which says the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of the citizens in the several states. What that means is that as long as you're allowed to do something in anything you're allowed to do in one state, you should be allowed to do in the several states. That's not true anymore. That's particularly not true with respect to, SB 8, which was the Texas law that, sometimes called the Fugitive Uterus Act, which sets
God.
a bounty system for people who assist in abortions in other states, really projecting the power of a particular state's law across their own borders. And of course, the Supreme Court very affirmatively refused to step in to block SB 8. This was right before they passed the Dobbs ruling. So the court has really rendered that entire privileges and immunities clause, in my view, pretty moot.
Yeah, you're seeing, in red states, we're going to do a print issue about this,
Yeah,
but an attempt with for with lacking national power, perhaps like the national power to do an abortion ban or other things that conservatives want, an attempt to leverage control of red state governments to like persecute the citizens of blue states, almost like for its own sake, thinking
right.
that, transgender people or, people with unwanted pregnancies or medically unviable pregnancies who try to flee to another state,
Yeah.
you could be subject to the coercive state violence, even though you may not be present in the state or not even live there at all.
We're moving on to the amendments. We're going to go to the Bill of Rights, and the First Amendment is intended to protect freedom of worship, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom from the respecting an establishment of religion. And this has become very distorted throughout not just this, but several Supreme Court sessions. Do we have a First Amendment or what should I cut out of here?
I think we have a First Amendment, and what it says is that billionaires can spend as much money as they want in political campaigns.
Right.
That's the First Amendment jurisprudence that's really hot now. But yeah, I mean, you look at it all across the country in red states. It's just an all-out assault on First Amendment rights of all kinds. We have the Ten Commandments being posted in like
Right.
classrooms and government buildings in Louisiana.
Right.
Other states are trying to do this as well. Massive speech restraints on teachers and professors across the country. The so-called "Don't Say Gay" law, though that was recently partially struck
Yeah.
down in federal court, not by the Supreme Court. Um, in Mississippi, you may remember there was this little, rinky-dink independent outfit that uncovered massive welfare fraud. Basically, they were taking, the
Yeah.
welfare money that was block granted under the welfare reform passed under Bill Clinton in 1996 and giving it to Brett Favre. Um,
Hmm.
and the response to that is to persecute the reporters, to try to get them to reveal their sources or put them in jail. That this, your classic authoritarian type of system in which critics of the regime are subject to legal punishment. This is Putin's Russia does this all the time. Jim Crow South is notorious for this sort of thing. Um, and
Absolutely.
yeah,
So
so
so then the Fourth Amendment, unreasonable search and seizure. We obviously have changed that law in terrific ways in terms of government spying and the ability to seize property. Now the ability to seize property from the homeless. That also plays into the Eighth Amendment after what was put together this year on the protection. That's the Eighth Amendment protection is supposed to be against cruel and unusual punishment. You now can be sent to jail for just not having a home, which seems rather cruel and unusual. There's the due process laws, which we've seen over the years, whether through drone programs or other extrajudicial killing programs. We've seen those rendered fairly moot. Um, the criminal justice system in general, with its extreme focus on plea bargains, seems to deny the right of trial by jury. We can talk about the 14th Amendment, which was one of the Reconstruction amendments, which really has gone by the wayside. But before that, let's talk about the one amendment that I can keep in this pocket constitution, the one that maybe I can amend it a little bit to make it stronger rather than to weaken it, and that's the Second Amendment.
yeah, yeah, this is another one where it now, according to the Supreme Court, this I don't think was a Roberts, or the most current iteration of the Roberts Court, but back in, what was it, 2008, where they established for the first time that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to bear arms, which is quite weird because it doesn't say that. It says
Right.
in keeping with the necessity of a well-regulated militia, the right of the
Right.
people to keep and bear arms. And like this, you read up on the history, this is all about not having a standing army. Those are thought to be a threat to a Republican, small R Republican government, because militaries, traditionally, you look at the history of Rome and stuff, the tendency of seizing power, standing army is thought to be very dangerous. And so what you needed was citizen militias. And so you'd have to have, all your yeoman farmers to get their muskets or whatever, their smoothbore muskets, and to be able to stand up a military in case of emergency without having a standing military. All that has been dead for hundreds of years now. We've had a standing army, since, I mean, shoot, what, at least before World War I. Now, of course, the military is huge, and so it's been completely rewritten. And I think it was Warren Burger, the conservative chief justice, who said that the idea this protects an individual right to bear arms is a fraud. That it was carried out by the gun manufacturers and right-wing ideologues. But yeah, that we had a recent decision that overruled the Trump administration ban on bump stocks. That
Right.
this is basically a different way of making a fully automatic weapon, where instead of the reloading mechanism happening within like the casing of the rifle, it's basically just a little spring that allows you to hold the trigger down, and then it will pull the trigger repeatedly against your finger without you having to pull it
Right.
over and over again. And even that, now those are legal again. And by the way, worth remembering that ban passed after the Las Vegas massacre. The guy used a bump stock to spray a country music festival and kill, what was it, 60 people and wound like hundreds more. Um, and that's not even, it's like automatic weapons are not even like that big of a deal, given how good semi-automatic assault rifles have become. It's actually more accurate. It's pretty hard to shoot an automatic weapon in an accurate fashion. Um, but still, yeah, you have this like cancerous tumor of gun rights that's completely grown beyond all recognition. And the
Right.
idea, one last comment, the idea that the founders would have considered this um, you know, outrageous in the extreme is nuts. James Madison himself drafted a gun control bill for the Virginia House of Delegates that had a sweeping restriction on gun rights, said that you cannot carry your gun outside of your own property, without
Right.
like, explicit government mobilization of the militia and whatnot. It didn't pass, but it proves that Madison, who wrote the Second Amendment, thought that very
Right.
strict regulations on
Right.
gun use, possession, and so on is completely constitutional. And yeah, you just make it
So,
up. Who cares?
so if we sort of plotted, sometimes you see these plots of uh, the electoral map, and it looks like a sea of red. But then when you rejigger it to the actual population of the various portions, you have these big blobs of blue in
Yeah.
there. If you would plot the Constitution out, the blob for the Second Amendment would be so totalistic at this point that the Constitution would basically be a gun rights manual. Like it would basically be mostly about guns and then about a few other things that come in. But the last one I want to talk about is the 14th Amendment, because what's interesting here is that the 14th Amendment has a bunch of different sections, all of which have been changed by different rulings, right?
Yeah.
So you start with the 14th Amendment, Section 1, which again was about privileges and immunities and making sure that all people, regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, etc., are protected. This obviously has been damaged in multiple ways. Whether you want to talk about Shelby County versus Holder and voting rights of Black citizens, or a whole bunch of other ones. Next year, there's going to be a case on transgender rights, on gender affirming care bans in the states, which could attack 14th Amendment Section 1 even further. You go to Section 2, says it's almost an unknown section of the Constitution, which says it states that actually discriminate against their citizens through making them unable to vote for voter suppression tactics. That they should lose representatives in the House of Representatives. That's never been enforced. There's an active legislation right now trying to show that through voter suppression that you could eliminate certain representatives from various states. It's not going anywhere. So that's been sort of rubbed out. Section 3 is about no one who committed an insurrection against the public should be able to hold office. Earlier this year, that was kind of rubbed out. The fourth section of the 14th Amendment is about the validity of the public debt not being questioned. That's kind of been rubbed out by custom because those who are dealing with the debt limit never invoke that section of the Constitution, maybe because they think the Supreme Court will somehow change it again. So it's almost like every section of that very important Reconstruction Amendment, the Supreme Court has managed to tear it pretty much asunder.
Yeah. Yeah. That one's toast, pretty much from soup to nuts. And yeah,
All
I mean
right.
the one about traitors in government, it's like that this doesn't seem like a totally ridiculous thing. And
Right.
yet, yeah, when someone tried to throw Trump off the ballot in Colorado, saying that he tried to overthrow the government, the Supreme Court said no. Trump's our special boy, and he gets special
Right.
protections to run for office after he tried to burn the Constitution to the ground and set himself up as dictator for life. Yeah, the other one I want to mention, um,
Hmm.
the 15th Amendment, this isn't a recent decision, but Shelby County versus Holder, struck down the pre-clearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act, and like it's such a simple amendment. It says you cannot stop people from voting based on what is it, race or previous condition of servitude, and
Right.
Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Like that, it couldn't be clearer than that. It's like they were being racist, and the southern states,
Right.
these particular jurisdictions, were being incredibly racist and disenfranchising the black citizens of those states, and the government said, no, you can't do that. Like this is why Roberts didn't even refer to the Constitution in that ruling, because
Right.
it's preposterous that amendment does not enable the Voting Rights Act.
Right.
It's
Well,
completely
race is
ridiculous.
over. Racism is over. Is what Chief Justice Roberts said. So yeah. So now I have like half a constitution here. So now, hopefully everybody at home was following along, so they can cross their little pieces out. Obviously, we have talked in the past. You've written in the past about things to do about this. I mentioned earlier that I think Congress is going to have to be much more clear in their directives to the executive branch. I think Congress is going to have to invoke some provisions that they haven't been terribly willing to invoke in the past, like jurisdiction stripping. And I think that, as you've written, the entire idea that judicial review, which got us to this half of the Constitution that we have, needs to be seriously rethought. Any other things that we should be thinking about in terms of you know how to go forward?
Yeah, I guess I would just emphasize that, yeah, judicial review does not appear explicitly in the Constitution, and the idea has been very controversial throughout most of American history. Thomas Jefferson thought judicial review is terrible, that it made the Supreme Court way too powerful. Um, multiple presidents in the 19th century challenged judicial review, above all Lincoln, who was ordered by Chief Justice Roger Taney to, he was held in contempt for not releasing like basically a Confederate spy, and
Right.
Lincoln said, "No, I'm not doing that." Um,
Right.
Obviously, there's Roosevelt's attempt to add justices to the court, which didn't work. But then, on the other hand, after he did
Kind of
that, the
did. Yeah.
court stopped ruling against New Deal legislation.
Right.
Um, and yeah, I think, whether you agree that judicial review is important or not, like it can't be absolute. It can't just be that the Supreme Court has dictatorial authority over all of us and it can just say whatever it wants. There has to be a line somewhere. Like suppose
Right.
they just said Donald Trump's president now. Like is Biden just going to say, okay,
Well,
that
the court has to be respected. Their opinion has to be respected.
yeah, we wouldn't want to threaten their legitimacy.
Yeah.
But
Right. Anyway, well, it's I think something that is going to be at the forefront of of politics and policy for the next several years. What to do about this kind of runaway court. However, what means by which government and the other two branches of government are going to, or what real willingness they're going to have to deal with that, is dependent on what happens in November. And obviously, over the last couple of weeks, we've had this utter freak out from pretty much everybody since, in the last week, since the debate in particular, over whether Joe Biden should go forward with this campaign. Tonight, actually, George Stephanopoulos is interviewing the president. This is seen, for some reason, as kind of a threshold event. Even though it's going to be on tape, it's only going to be a 15-minute interview, I think. So that seems like an unduly amount pressure on one TV appearance, and the president is also making appearances in Wisconsin, maybe also Pennsylvania, over the next couple of days. We've heard last week we had kind of the full freak out on display here. We had a bunch of people on from the staff talking about what they think about this. I'm curious to get your thoughts on if you believe that Trump is a unique threat to the nation, you want to put your best foot forward in the election. And how do you see Joe Biden fitting into that at this point?
Yeah. I mean, I guess, the thing to admit up front is that that was a disastrous debate and he just did very poorly. I went back and I um, watched to refresh my memory the debate with Paul Ryan in 2012 between Biden and Paul Ryan when Biden
Yeah,
was vice president, and Biden rinsed him.
yeah,
A guy who was a lot younger than he was, and he did very well. He
yeah.
back in the day.
Interestingly, I mean, the way that sequence went is that Obama and Romney, the first debate went very badly for Obama.
Yep.
And the next debate in that sequence was the vice presidential debate, right?
Hmm.
So, in many ways, Biden mopping the floor with Paul Ryan really got the campaign back on track. Like he was the secret weapon in reversing that bad debate.
Yeah. And I guess, like up until this point, I was basically dismissive of the idea of replacing Biden. I thought we were stuck with him. There's no way he's going to step aside for anyone. Um, but the fact that uh, practically the entire mainstream press, led above all by the New York Times, has just been dogpiling him. I mean, I would
Yeah,
compare it to sort of the volume of coverage after like 9/11, that level of absolute hysterical frenzy. Um,
yeah,
and that part of it strikes me as like grossly irresponsible. All this Trump stuff, now the president's a king and he can murder people with impunity. That's basically not getting any coverage at all. And
mm-hmm.
to the extent it seems very risky to me because if Biden doesn't drop out, what you've done is basically
Right,
run his central campaign message on the front pages of every newspaper and every newscast for weeks and probably for the rest of the campaign. It's
right,
Biden old is the her emails of this election
yeah,
cycle. Um, that said, I guess I mean one of the duties of the president is to not suffer that type of bad news coverage,
right.
and
At
um,
least in the campaign, yeah. Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, it's grossly unfair, especially from the New York Times. I mean, I hope they don't live this down. I mean, good grief, it seems like mostly driven by Dash Sulzberger's peak at not getting an exclusive interview with Biden. Um, but at a certain point, perhaps
Yeah, you go to war with the media you have, and if this isn't going to stop, and it's not going to stop, what effect does that have on the campaign, and what does that do to the odds of Biden overcoming this?
yeah.
Um, I would say two things. The first is that I mean, what actually strikes me about the media coverage is that a lot of it is reporters telling on themselves, or at least
Mm-hmm.
wanting to tell a story that they're telling on themselves. So Olivia Nuzzi had this piece in the New York Magazine, right, where she talks about meeting the president at some kind of rope line, and saying that he looked kind of out of it or whatever. And what you realize in that piece is that was months ago. And like, if
Yeah.
you actually had this issue, why didn't you say it then? Why were you only given sort of the carte blanche to say this after the debate performance? Why were you covering up? Is this as much a media cover up as anything else? Why were you not willing to detonate this bomb until after that happened, and now you're piling on the feeding frenzy? So I think that's interesting. The other thing that is interesting to me is it says a lot about where democratic politics is right now, that the only sort of group of people that are seen as having the gravitas and the leverage to move Biden to make a decision to drop out are elite donors.
Yep.
So, in previous iterations of the Democratic Party, there were mass membership organizations that had a lot of clout, a lot of leverage, whether it was civil rights groups, whether it was unions, and now we've moved towards this sort of state of affairs where uh, foundations uh, bankroll much of politics on the left. Large donors are much more a factor. Mass membership organizations that are self-funding don't really exist very much, and the donor class really controls the show to a big extent, and that's bad for politics in general, right? I think to have, I mean, we already know that that's the case on the right, right? I mean, there's
Yeah.
there's full alignment between the interests of the right and the interests of very wealthy people, but now we have the elite donor class kind of being the only refuge. You have people saying, well, rich people should cut off the money to Biden. I don't get them out in a hurry. Well, what would the interests of elite donors be for that replacement, and what promises would need to be made, and all of these kinds of things. So I think that's a real dangerous aspect of this thing, and it goes beyond this election. It's really about the structure of democratic politics itself.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think to your point, if you think about it for a while, I'm fairly convinced that if Biden were to step down, and it really is basically up to him and him alone at the end of the day,
Correct.
step down from the campaign, um, Kamala Harris is the only viable substitute.
Yeah.
As you wrote in a piece, like she's the only one who could possibly have full access to the massive campaign horde that the Biden campaign has assembled.
Right.
Um, she's the only one who's been on the primary ballots that Biden overwhelmingly
Right.
won.
So at least there's some democratic legitimacy there. Yeah.
Yeah. And, you see, I mean, and that's kind of what gives me pause a little bit about throwing Biden aside is that a a lot of the people who are calling for it are not saying, well, and it has to be Harris. Like that's the only like realistic alternative. You see these proposals to have like a convention like back in the 19th century with smoke-filled
Right.
rooms. And we're going to
Right.
save democracy by taking this whole democratic procedure, which was recently rewritten in response to the Bernie campaign's demands in 2020 and
Right.
2016. And we're just going to throw that in the garbage. And we're going to
Right.
get the, party donors or whatever and the big wigs and the Obamas or whoever. And we're just going to, somehow pick one of these governors, or Gavin Newsom or Gretchen Whitmer or JB Pritzker or
And
somebody.
and then
And
after that, we're going to run a campaign to save democracy.
it's
Right.
yeah, it's I mean you would have everyone fighting like cats in a sack, and all of the issues that split the Democratic coalition, above all the war in Gaza, are going to come back in a big way. People are going to be attacking each other from both sides on that issue. And um, you know, are the donors going to get
Yeah.
behind Kamala Harris? It's not hard to think of an argument in which Harris might be weaker than Biden at the end of the day when it comes time to vote. She's a woman, never had a woman president, a lot of sexism in the electorate. She's a black woman, a lot of racism in the electorate. You look at the polls now, and she seems to be doing better than Biden, but that's in response to the press just absolutely savaging him for a week and change now. Is
Yeah.
the New York Times going to think of something to do to Harris? Um,
You're already seeing the stirrings of it's not the crime, it's a cover up narrative that positions Harris as, why was she covering for this for so long? I think she's helped by the fact that nobody believes that she was in the inner circle of the Biden administration. But but yeah, I mean, you're already seeing like the pivot as the campaign maybe pivots. Well, we'll probably have some more clarity on this next week, so we'll table that. There was one question from the chat. Why don't we have more Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it? Pushback from Democratic chief executives. I mean, it's true. We didn't really see much of that. We saw a little bit like when Ron Wyden was talking about the mifepristone ruling in that guy, that right wing judge down in
Kaczmarek.
Texas.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Wyden said something to the order of, "Well, we just shouldn't follow this in any way." And that was like a rare pierce of the armor, which did go back to kind of an Andrew Jackson kind of approach to this. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, you're dealing with the sort of like institutional mindset among Democrats. They're just have developed over the years a pathological unwillingness to sort of like push the boundaries of politics, to play constitutional hardball like conservatives do.
Right.
It's, Biden assembled like a bunch of graybeards to talk about court reform, and they basically just had a limp shrug at the end of it, and like, well,
Right. Yeah.
okay, I guess we're just not
Here
going to
we
do anything.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, if you want to do nothing in Washington, you appoint a blue ribbon commission.
yeah.
So that's kind of what happened there. All right, let's wrap this up. Let's get to in the last 10 minutes here. The UK had its election on July 4th, which I thought was appropriate, especially because it threw out the Tories. That just is, pretty poetic. So let's talk about the UK election a little bit. What did you see out of that interested you?
Yeah, as I was reading the polls and stuff, everyone was predicting a Labor landslide, which is exactly what happened. They got 412 seats. I think a majority
Mm-hmm.
is like 330.
Yeah.
The Tories lost 2/3 of their seats. They're down to 121. It's like the worst election result in the history of the Conservative Party. And that,
Yeah.
you can't help but enjoy that a little bit. Um, Under the hood, though, I mean, this is
Yeah.
the American electoral system is almost uniquely broken. But boy, the British one has its problems. So what I was shocked to learn is that Labor did barely better than they did in 20 uh
19.
19,
Yeah.
the last
Yeah.
election, and actually much worse than they did in 2017 in terms of the number of votes that they got and the share of the votes that they got in 2017. So they got 32% under Jeremy Corbyn in 2019. They lost, and Jeremy Corbyn had to resign as leader of the party. This time they got 34%. And
Right.
that, due to the dynamics of first past the post constituencies, got them a gigantic majority.
Right.
And I guess
And the reason
basically,
is that the conservatives split, right?
yep,
So there was the Conservative Party, the Tories, that got something like 24%. And then the Reform Party under Nigel Farage, was like the Eurosceptic far right, got about 14%. So if you put those together, they got more votes
yeah,
than the Labour Party. However, because of that split in each various riding, the Labour Party was able to beat a fractured right, and that basically shows you that Keir Starmer, the head of the Labour Party, who will now become prime minister, didn't really get a mandate. He got the fact he benefited from the fact that the Conservatives were completely fractured and had run the country in the ground for 14 years. So they're going to have to get their mandate by governing, the Labour Party is, rather than through an election, because they clearly did not. Like you said, they did worse than in 2017 under Corbyn, when conservatives still had a majority of the House of Commons.
yeah, yeah. I believe they got 42% of the vote back then. And yeah, Starmer, as I've sort of just been watching with like half an eye on the last several months of British politics, has just basically not tried not to say anything.
Yeah.
Not made any bold promises. It's just like a few little milk toast reforms here and there. But I mean, I could arguably like a wise campaign decision, a sort of like never interrupt your
Right,
enemy when he's making a mistake type of thing, and he just sort of fell
right,
ass backwards into the prime ministership. But yeah,
right,
as you say now, you look at that, and if the conservatives recoalesce around somebody, maybe Nigel Farage, then the Labor is toast. And so they're going to
right,
have to build some legitimacy around fixing the problems caused by the
right.
conservative government. And there's plenty of them. I was just looking up real GDP per capita in the UK, basically flat since 2007.
Mm,
Um, Atrocious
yeah.
record. I think the worst in like modern British history, going back to the 18th century. It
Wow.
was a similar period, worse than the Great Depression.
Wow.
If you go
Yeah.
from point to point.
And clearly, the fact that this was a known landslide, that everyone in Britain was pretty clear on what was going to happen in this election, that clearly had an impact on turnout.
Yep.
Maybe there are pro Labor supporters out there that figured I don't really need to vote because Labor is going to win. Or maybe even on the other side, the conservatives being so resigned to the outcome that they didn't vote. So the low turnout makes a lot of sense because it was supposed to be a 20-point landslide. In the end, it was like a 10-point landslide. It was 34-24 between Labor and conservative, but because of the distorting impacts, which I'm sure Wisconsin was really like looking at wistfully, like, come on, we could have had that. Uh, uh, you know, um, so yeah, I mean, I think that clearly now that they don't have to hide their record or what their plans are, they're going to have to come up with something that does a much better job than the flat growth for 16, 17 years that we've seen.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, their problem, as I see it, is just the crying out for investment.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically been, 16 years or whatever of the country just slowly falling to pieces. That the National Health Service in particular is in atrocious shape, and it's all from lack of spending. And um, I mean, I don't know. Bob has a somewhat optimistic take, Robert Kuttner, that I'm going to put
Yeah.
on the website as soon as we're done with this. And he makes a point that Starmer has proposed some
Yeah,
worthwhile.
yeah, particularly around like public schools. I think
Yeah,
he was looking at a particular thing, a tax that would
yeah.
fund public
And
schools.
unlike almost everyone in the Conservative Party and a lot of labor leaders, he actually comes from a working class background. So
Right,
he might surprise us. He definitely did not run on, doing massive Biden style, investments in building up economic capacity. But, you know, even from a kind of like neoliberal framework in terms of keeping the budget balance and stuff like that, there's a perfectly sound case for investment specifically to say like, well,
right,
our roads and bridges are falling apart, the high-speed rail is atrocious, all these things.
right,
We're going to put money, a one-time dose of money in there, and that's going to pay off over the long term in terms of faster
right.
economic growth, more tax money, and
Uh,
all the rest of it. And
Fix the
but
damn roads agenda, much like the Midwest and Gretchen Whitmer. Maybe that's what we see. We'll find out. I mean, I think there's a similar dynamic in the French elections, which we're going to see the second round of this weekend, where this fracturing of in this case, the left and the center was going to threaten to have a similar effect as with Labour in the UK, and put the National Rally, which is Marine Le Pen's group, into the lead. But what has happened is that the left coalesced in a national front kind of way. All the various four fractured left parties, the communists, the socialists, the Greens, and Jean-Luc Mélenchon's party, all came together and ran as a front in those elections. And then there's this weird runoff situation in France where the first round is everybody, and the second round is anybody who got more than 12%. So in a lot of these districts, you had three candidates. You left. You had the Marine Le Pen group, the centrist with Macron, and the left, this National Front left. And if those in many districts, if those stayed in play, the center and the left would split the vote, and the right would become, the far right would get the seat. So in a lot of these seats, either the centrist or the leftist candidate, whoever finished in third, actually dropped out to make it a head-to-head matchup, and that happened a lot actually. And so now the expectation is that uh, the far right will win a plurality, but not a majority, because of this strategic effort on the part of the center and the left. It was more strategic on the left. The Macron had to be dragged kicking and screaming into this strategy, but it does seem like it's going to hold off the far right from taking over the French National Assembly for the first time since the Vichy government.
Yeah, that's not a historical resonance you want to see. Yeah. But
Right?
that
Yeah, that's true.
that's what I would, maybe as a closing comment, I would caution
Yeah,
if Sir Keir happens to be watching, um,
yeah, which I'm
that
sure he
is
is.
the danger facing you, that it could be the Nigel Farage party
Mm-hmm.
basically engross the Tory vote. And if you don't start fixing some potholes, buddy,
Yeah,
let's get after it.
absolutely. Absolutely. So we end on that. Thank you, Ryan Cooper, managing editor, American Prospect. Thank you for being here. We will be here once again next week, as always, 12:30 Eastern, and you'll be able to see this, and you can actually see all of these weekly roundups over at our YouTube page, the American Prospects YouTube channel, and which you're on right now if you're watching this, and we also put these up on the website, so you can watch it over the weekend. But thanks a lot. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye bye, everyone.